Well, folks, this is our first attempt at the Zoom meeting for our presentations. As you all know, there's no way that we could possibly do this at Hatch Auditorium safely. So this is our inaugural event. I particularly want to thank Will Greene. When I first approached him with this idea, he told me that he was a Luddite, which I had to go look up and and found out what that meant. But now he is practically Bill Gates on this thing. So uh, we're hoping that this will go pretty smoothly. The audio buttons, if you're looking at your little taskbar on the very left side, you'll see a microphone. That microphone, I'm going to have mine open, and Will have his open, of course, while he's running his PowerPoint. Uh, uh, he'll be able to speak over that, but these microphones on these things are very sensitive, so we would ask everybody to keep their microphones on mute so that we don't pick up any background noises. Also on your little taskbar, you'll see the word chat. If you press chat, it'll bring up a text box. If you have any questions for Will, go ahead and type your question into that text box. And then at the end of Will's presentation, we will go through and answer as many of the questions as we can. Depending on how many there are, we'll see how many we can get through. So that would be using the chat bar. Jennifer Chapman and her husband Ralph are moving on to Florida. We certainly want to wish them all the best. Jennifer has been our secretary for the last several years, and has just been absolute delight to work with. One of the most competent folks that I've ever come across, and they will certainly be missed. But good luck to them in Florida. Unfortunately, they'll be leaving here on September 21st, I believe it is. So we will not be able to say goodbye to them as we would have hoped had we been at Hatch Auditorium. But we're hoping that maybe they'll have reason to come back into the area for some reason and visit us when we get back to Hatch. Let me go through the videos here. We'll do the Pledge of Allegiance in just a minute. Next month, we have Jack Davis, William C. Jack Davis. That'll be on October the 6th to 7 o'clock. It'll be another Zoom presentation. Jack's talk will be Flight into Oblivion, the escape of the Confederate government from May 1865. So we look forward to that. We have not been, I get so many emails about online videos that there's no way in the world that I could possibly get them all on the emails for you to keep up with them. Nobody needs to get that many emails. But what you see here are some of the sites that are producing a lot of videos. The Civil War Roundtable Congress, of course, our North Carolina Maritime Museum at Southport. If you go to our Facebook page at BrunswickCivilWarRoundtable.com, you'll find a handful or so of videos. We certainly want to thank Katie for putting the videos together with myself and Jim McKee. The Southport Historical Society are doing presentations on a fairly regular basis on some Southport history, Bald Head Island history, So you may want to check there, Southport Historical Society. I'm sorry. And then, of course, you know, if you just go to YouTube and type in Gettysburg, there are a number of short videos that are done by the rangers at the various national park services that are actually tours of sections of each of the battlefields. They are excellent. So if you're looking for some Civil War online, it is not difficult to find it. It is past 7 o'clock. Let's go back and we will do the Pledge of Allegiance, except no one can hear. Can we turn on the microphones for just a second, then turn them back off, Pat?
Everybody should be able to unmute themselves now.
Okay, go ahead and press that little microphone, and then when the red circle with the line goes away, that means that your microphone is hot. Okay.
Okay.
We're looking at a lot of people with their mics open.
Yeah. Okay.
Ours is open.
Okay. Is everybody ready?
Yes.
On Pledge of Allegiance on 3. 1, 2, 3. I pledge allegiance
to the flag
United
The United States of America,
of America,
and to
the republic for which it stands,
One nation,
nation,
under God,
indivisible,
indivisible,
with
liberty
and justice for all.
justice for all.
God bless America.
Okay, well, that's probably that one's not going to make it to the album, but thank you for doing it anyway.
Mike, you're going to have to unmute yourself.
I got him.
Unmute. Okay. We will be having our elections in December as normal. So if anyone is interested in a leadership position, contact myself, Jack Carpenter, or somebody on the board of directors, and we would certainly be happy to speak with you about positions. Okay, let's get to the business. Will Greene tonight, and like I say, I really appreciate Will stepping up and learning how to do the Zoom thing. We ran a practice session last month, and it went off great, and we're just happy that he was willing to step out of the box and do this for us. I've had a lot of really good days with the Brunswick Civil War Roundtable, and one of the best days that I had was when Will Greene took our group on a trip from Petersburg to Appomattox. Coming back from the trip, we had a couple hours ride there and got to sit next to Will, and I swear we talked for 2 hours, and I'm not sure we ever talked about history. We talked about the Baltimore Colts and different things like that. And when I left, I said to myself, what kind of moron am I? Here I am sitting next to Will Greene for 2 hours and didn't talk any history. But it was really one of the fun days that I've had in association with the Roundtable. Will has had such a career, and let me run through some of this for you. Let's see, graduated Florida State University, postgraduate work at LSU. After he left LSU, he went to work for the National Park Service, and he worked at one of my favorite parks at Chalmette in New Orleans, which is great because you can gamble across the street from all night, and then when the park opens, go across the street and visit the park. It's one of those battlefields where you are looking straight up at the Mississippi River. It's a wonderful little park. I'm not sure what its condition is these days after Katrina. I understand that they came back, but I'm not exactly sure about that. But in 1990, Will left the National Park Service and was named the first director of the Civil War Preservation Trust. Now we call it the Civil War Trust. This is the premier fundraising and support group for battlefields of the Civil War. And recently, in the last year or two, they have expanded to not just Civil War battlefields, but battlefields of the American Revolution and others that took place on our country's land. 1995, he became first director of Pamplin Park at Petersburg. I was living in Richmond at that time, and I remember the trailers that they started with, and boy, he has certainly brought that organization a long way. He was also director of the National Museum of the Civil War Soldier, which in 1999. In 2005, President Bush assigned him to oversee the Institute of Museum and Library Services. This oversaw, advised, and supported the nation's museums and libraries. And in 2017, Will retired. And the poor guy's playing golf every week now, and we've been trying to get together in Myrtle Beach to play, and after saying these nice things, I'm probably expecting to get 2 strokes from him when we do that. But when not on the golf course, he is working on a definitive work on a trilogy on the Petersburg campaign. And if you're familiar with Will's books, you know the research that goes into them. And I believe that his trilogy will do for Petersburg what Ed Bars's trilogy of Vicksburg did for that battlefield way back when. But seriously, we appreciate the effort that he has made to be here with us tonight. Not many would go that far. But tonight we're going to hear from Will about the first Petersburg offensive. So let me get out of my program. There we go. And Will can bring up his program.
There we go. Well,
Hey, how about that?
Mike, thanks very much for that very generous introduction. And Gar and Pat, I really appreciate all that you've done to make this possible. This is my first Zooming experience, so if things go south, I hope everyone will be understanding. But as the man said as he fell off the Wrigley building, so far, so good. Tonight, I want to talk about, as Mike said, the first Petersburg offensive. We all know Edward Porter Alexander, the famous Confederate artillerist, who thought that the initial struggle for Petersburg was the most interesting point in the whole military history of the Confederacy. Now, you might not agree with Alexander, but certainly, had events been different between June 15th and 18th, 1864, the capture of Petersburg at that time would have certainly altered the trajectory of the Civil War dramatically, perhaps shortening it by months. So my talk this evening is going to address the movement to and the bloody combat of those 4 days and examine why a Union Army that enjoyed overwhelming numerical superiority failed to drive the outnumbered Confederates away from Petersburg. All right, now, Pat, I'm not seeming to be able to advance my screen, my PowerPoint here.
Hit the enter key and maybe it'll move.
Not yet. We were doing just fine, and now it is not seeming to work. So let's try something else here.
Why don't you close down the, close the app and reopen it?
Okay. Let's try it again. Nope.
No, I mean, actually, PowerPoint, just turn it completely off.
Okay. Well, we were doing so well, weren't we? All right. Let's see if we can't get this thing going here now.
Yeah, just restart PowerPoint and then restart the slideshow.
Have you, I apologize for this, folks. It was working just fine when we did our practice, but of course that's Murphy's Law, I guess. All right, so here's the PowerPoint. And there's full screen. And am I on? Okay, am I on at all? Are you seeing me?
We're seeing you. Why don't you go to share screen?
All right, all I've got is the PowerPoint on my screen here, Pat.
All right, Joe, you want to minimize that window
All right.
so that so you can see your Zoom window, and there'll be a green share screen button at the bottom.
I'm gonna get completely out of, all right, I got Zoom on there now.
Yeah, share screen at the bottom.
I don't see that.
Okay, along the very bottom of your monitor, you should see something that says Zoom meeting.
All I've got is Zoom on there.
Well, you should see one that says Zoom meeting farther down.
All right, I've got back on to the
Meeting. And you see the share screen button?
I do.
Let's share screen again and see what happens.
Okay, let's try it one more time.
So what you're looking for, what you've done is you've shared the wrong one. You want to share the PowerPoint.
All right.
That's fine. Now just, where's your PowerPoint?
I'm going to put that right up. Okay.
Looking good. There
All
you go. Now let's go to the next slide.
We got it. All
There
right.
you go.
Again, I appreciate that, Pat. Thank you. All right. Now, let's get back to the history. The Petersburg Campaign, of course, originates in the elevation of Ulysses S. Grant, the supreme command of all Union armies in the spring of 1864. Grant brought two strategic principles to his new post. First, apply simultaneous pressure across all theaters of the war. And second, in Virginia, where he chose to make his headquarters with George G. Meade's Army of the Potomac, pursue relentless offensive operations, rejecting the previous experience of fighting a major battle, followed by a period of refitting and inactivity. Grant would implement his plan in early May, launching his protege, William T. Sherman, into North Georgia, aimed at defeating Joseph Johnston's forces and targeting the railroad hub at Atlanta. In Virginia, Meade would apply a laser focus to Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, while smaller forces moved up the Shenandoah Valley and ascended the James River to Bermuda Hundred, south of Richmond. Both of these auxiliary campaigns failed in mid-May. Franz Sigel defeated at Newmarket in the Valley, and Benjamin Butler's Army of the James stymied at Bermuda Hundred. The Army of the Potomac crossed the Rapidan River and fought a series of costly engagements at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor, losing some 60,000 men in the process, but inflicting sufficient losses on Lee that all but destroyed Lee's offensive capabilities. A new threat in the valley prompted Lee to detach Jubal early and about 1/3 of his force, ensuring that Lee would, by necessity, adopt a defensive posture against Grant and Meade. With Butler's access to Richmond blocked by Confederate forces under P.G.T. Beauregard at Bermuda Hundred, and Lee immovable in his defense of the Confederate capital north of the James River, Grant made a bold decision. He would secretly shift Meade's entire army across the James and capture Petersburg, 23 miles south of Richmond, and the capital's logistical and supply nexus. Petersburg, a thriving railroad and industrial center before the war, boasted the second largest population in Virginia and the seventh largest in the entire Confederacy. No fewer than 5 railroads led to the Cockade City, 3 of which, the Richmond and Petersburg, the South Side, and the Petersburg and Weldon, remained crucial to Confederate supply systems on the eve of the campaign. In fact, with the Virginia Central, the Richmond and York River, and the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac railroads, all interdicted by Union forces, only one line led into Richmond without first going through Petersburg. So the point of all this is that with Petersburg in Union hands, Richmond would be doomed, and its loss, symbolically and industrially, would sound the death knell of the Confederacy. So there was much at stake as Grant announced to the Washington authorities his intention to move south of the James River. Now, Grant was only too aware of the risk involved in this maneuver. He must disengage from the lines around Cold Harbor without Lee knowing that he had gone in order to gain a head start on what he knew would be a much longer route to Petersburg than Lee's. Once Lee realized that he had departed, Grant would need to persuade the Confederate commander that he intended to approach Richmond along the same routes used by George McClellan 2 years previously, north of the James. Now, even if all this went according to plan, Grant must still march 50 miles, negotiate the swampy Chickahominy River, and then cross the mighty James, where the James River was as much as 4,000 feet wide and 80 feet deep. And he needed to do so at a place that was beyond Confederate intelligence. At every point in the journey, the Army of the Potomac would be spread out and vulnerable, never more so than in the process of crossing the James. The movement also would put Butler's army in jeopardy, as Grant would be too distant to rescue the beast if Lee attacked him. Moreover, such an operation defied the preference of the administration, which nurtured a perpetual fear for the safety of the national capital, and saw the removal of Meade's army as an invitation to the Confederates to threaten Washington. Now, thus far, Grant's results as general-in-chief had been disappointing, and a disaster of any description en route to Petersburg would most likely exhaust even President Lincoln's willingness to keep Grant on a long leash. Now, Grant would conduct the movement to the James almost flawlessly, employing speed, stealth, deception, and solid planning to accomplish what Porter Alexander called the most brilliant piece of logistics during the war. On June 7th, he sent Phil Sheridan and 2/3 of Meade's cavalry northwest to wreck the Virginia Central Railroad, but also compel Lee to counter with his own cavalry, thus diminishing his ability to discover the shift to the James. He arranged for a motley fleet of ferry boats to move up the river from Fort Monroe and dispatched engineers to locate the best place to build what would be one of the longest military bridges in history. He then authorized Butler to destroy the railroad bridge across the Appomattox at Petersburg to thwart Lee's ability to rush defenders into the city from Richmond, although this effort would fail on June the 9th as old men and young boys manned the ramparts in time for Beauregard's forces to arrive. Now, Grant began his march on the night of June the 12th. 5 Army Corps silently abandoned the Union lines, including Baldy Smith's 18th Corps, Butler's army that had been sent to Grant prior to Cold Harbor. Each corps disengaging from north to south followed carefully chosen routes to expedite the movement. The 18th Corps marching to White House Landing on the Pamunkey River to make the journey by boat via Fort Monroe, then up the James. The Chickahominy River would be the first obstacle, described by one Union officer as a wide ditch, partly choked with rotten logs and full of brown, tepid, sickly-looking water, whose slow current would scarcely carry a straw along. The plan called for a crossing at 3 separate points via pontoon bridges, as all permanent spans had been destroyed. Union cavalry scattered the few Confederate pickets guarding the upper 2 sites, and the engineers promptly built their bridges. By dawn on June 13th, Meade's army was either south of the Chickahominy or poised to cross. Now, in order to persuade Lee that he was moving in McClellan's 1862 footsteps, Meade sent 2 divisions of Gouverneur Warren's 5th Corps and a brigade of cavalry west from Long Bridge toward the crossroads at Glendale, scene of a bitter battle on June 30th, 1862. Lee's army awoke on June 13th to discover the Yankees gone, while reports circulated about a Union force approaching Glendale. Lee ordered his 2 remaining infantry corps, the 1st under Richard H. Anderson and the 3rd under A.P. Hill, to move promptly and protect the roads to Richmond via Glendale and Malvern Hill. A sharp fight on the 13th left modest casualties in Glendale in Confederate hands, but reinforced the notion in Lee's mind that this thrust might represent Grant's next attempt to capture Richmond. Now, this is not to say that Lee was insensible to the possibility of a Union attempt to cross the James. He had predicted the likelihood of such an occurrence many days earlier. But this is important to remember. The Confederate commander's primary responsibility was to protect Richmond. And until he could be sure that Grant no longer posed a threat to the capital, Lee would maintain his position on the north side, counting on Beauregard to provide timely intelligence regarding enemy operations to the south. And because all of Meade's pontoons were required to span the Chickahominy, Grant placed Butler in charge of bridging the James. Butler dispatched his chief engineer, Brigadier General Godfrey Weitzel, to select the crossing point and oversee construction. Weitzel would recommend a point on the Wyandotte Peninsula where the river measured a little less than 2,000 feet across. But the banks here on both sides would require significant modification. So Butler assigned 150 men to cut huge cypress trees for use in building the approach to the swampy left bank, while others prepared a ramp on the south shore to connect the bridge to the local road network. Despite delays in receiving the necessary supplies, engineer troops worked with a will. And by midnight, June 14-15, they had completed a floating bridge consisting of 101 pontoon boats, nearly 2,000 feet long and 10 feet wide. The greatest bridge which the world has seen since the days of Xerxes, thought one admiring rebel. In the meantime, the Union infantry began gathering on the north bank. On June 14th, Winfield Hancock's 2nd Corps, Horatio Wright's 6th Corps, and Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps, and most of Warren's 5th Corps were on the north bank in position to cross, having negotiated the intervening ground without any interference. Meanwhile, Smith's 18th Corps moved up the James, preparing to disembark at Bermuda Hundred. Only the supply wagons guarded by the Black Division of the 9th Corps encountered problems, discovering that their designated crossing point was impractical and lacking sufficient pontoons to bridge the Chickahominy at their new alternative crossing. Despite this, Grant had achieved a spectacular logistical movement, one that rivaled anything in his Vicksburg campaign. He had stolen a march on Lee, and now he must simply advance toward Petersburg, overwhelm the thin line of defenders guarding the Cockade City, and reap the benefits of forcing Lee either to fight for his communications hub, accept a siege of Richmond, or abandon the Confederate capital. Now, as I mentioned, Lee was perfectly cognizant of the probability that sooner or later, Grant would shift operations to the south side. When Beauregard turned back Butler's tepid attempt to capture the bridge on June the 9th, the Creole general saw the portents of an ominous offensive. But Lee, uncertain of Grant's intentions, declined to consider Butler's effort as anything more than just a failed reconnaissance. No troops had left General Grant's army, Lee reassured a nervous Beauregard, and none could have crossed James River without being perceived. Now, Lee's confidence in his ability to counter any federal move derived from his own intelligence gathering capabilities and on Beauregard's line of scouts scattered down the James. Still, Lee shifted Robert Hoke's division on loan from Beauregard to Chaffin's Bluff on the north bank in position to rapidly cross the pontoon bridge there to reinforce Beauregard's remaining division of infantry, bolstered by local militia, responsible for protecting both Bermuda Hundred and Petersburg, or defend Richmond as circumstances required. By June 14th, as Grant arranged his Petersburg offensive, Lee and Beauregard speculated about the location and intentions of their enemy. Lee responded to an inquiry from President Davis early that afternoon by speculating that, quote, "I think the enemy must be preparing to move south of the James." Lee knew that the Federals were moving south, of course, and that large numbers of Yankees had boarded boats at White House Landing. But this could mean that Grant was just changing his base to Harrison's Landing, where he could be resupplied in preparation for a renewal of the previous day's attack at Glendale, and that the shipboard troops were on their way north, joining other troops whose terms of enlistment had expired. "We ought to be extremely watchful and guarded," Lee advised, but alertness did not equate to shifting focus from Richmond to Petersburg. Now, Beauregard, for his part, was a little less ambivalent about Grant's intentions. He beseeched the War Department to return Hoke's division immediately, warning that if some combination of Butler's and Meade's army attacked him, I cannot answer for consequences. When this appeal elicited no response, Beauregard took matters into his own hands and sent orders to Hoke at 10 p.m. June 14th to immediately move across the James. He also sent staff officers to Lee to justify the shift, but the absence of hard evidence and Beauregard's penchant for the fantastic left both Richmond and General Lee unconvinced of imminent disaster. Now, while Beauregard fretted and Lee remained cautious, Grant and Meade proceeded on June 14th with their offensive plans. In Grant's mind, Smith's 3 divisions would bear sole responsibility for capturing Petersburg. Smith's 18th Corps had boarded their transports on June 13th and by the next day began a staggered arrival at either Bermuda Hundred or up the Appomattox River at Broadway Landing and Point of Rocks. This disembarkation began in the afternoon and continued until after dark. Meanwhile, at 8:30 a.m. on the 14th, Meade issued orders to Hancock's troops to cross the river, utilizing the makeshift fleet to effect the passage, while the engineers supplied the finishing touches to the pontoon bridge for use by artillery and other wheeled vehicles. Before noon, the first of Hancock's corps boarded their boats, and by 1 o'clock they were ashore on the right bank, delighting the veterans, such as this New Jersey soldier who had grown disenchanted with the Virginia landscape. "As we steamed across the beautiful river, our hearts were filled with new hope," he wrote, "for we had bidden farewell to the swamp and miasmata of the Chickahominy, to the long lines of graves that stretched not only across the peninsula, but across the hills and valleys and streams, and through the fertile fields and tangled swamps of Virginia up to the Rapidan. We were bidding farewell to the old battlefields and entering upon a new line of operations." Now, it would take nearly until dawn on June 15th to ferry Hancock's 3 divisions across the river, but by 5 a.m., the Second Corps was comfortably encamped on the south side, many of the men cleansing the grime of 40 days of campaigning with swims in the James. Hancock remained on the north side, communicating by signal flag to the south bank. He confirmed to Meade, and this is important, that he had 3 days rations on hand, contradicting an earlier report that his corps would be out of food that night. So while the engineers finished their bridge and Hancock's troops ferried across the river, Grant boarded a steamer and met with Butler at Bermuda 100 to outline his plans for the attack. Grant told Butler that he would be solely responsible for the attack because Hancock would require reprovisioning before marching toward Petersburg. And with Meade's wagons stalled on the far side of the Chickahominy, and Butler must supply the required 60,000 rations by sending them by boat downriver. Without this precaution, Grant explained, the services of this corps, meaning Hancock's, cannot be had for an emergency tomorrow. Now, this message not only implied that Grant considered Hancock's participation in the June 15th offensive as necessary only in an emergency, but that he was unaware of Hancock's actual supply situation. Grant returned to the north side by sunset and informed Meade of Butler's supply mission because at 10 p.m. on the 14th, Meade told Hancock that he should await delivery and distribution of rations before embarking on his long march to Petersburg, ignoring Hancock's earlier report that he had food for 3 days. Now, as it unfolded on the morning of June 15th, multiple misunderstandings about the imminent arrival of these unneeded supplies froze the Second Corps at its camps, as Hancock obeyed Meade's directive to postpone the departure, a course of action he was unlikely to have followed if he had understood that his presence was required for the attack against Petersburg. Ultimately, ironically, the supply ships failed to arrive, so at 10:30 a.m., Meade released Hancock to begin his trek toward Petersburg. Thus, nearly 6 hours were wasted between the time the Second Corps was united on the South Shore and their departure for the front. 6 hours that might have changed history. As for the 18th Corps, Grant's orders to Butler were to begin Smith's march toward Petersburg that night and launch his attack, quote, as soon as he could after daylight. Grant assumed that Smith would capture Petersburg that morning and that Hancock would be available later in the day to help Smith hold the city should Lee try to redeem the situation. Now, Smith would have his 2 white divisions that arrived from Cold Harbor, 2 brigades taken from the Bermuda 100 line, 2,500 cavalry under August V. Kautz, and 3,700 African-American troops from City Point under General Edward Hinks, a total of about 14,000 men. However, Smith would claim that he learned nothing of this plan until late on the 14th, as the last of his troops disembarked. It would take time, of course, to organize his men, who had landed at various places, absent any divisional integrity. Smith must then cross the Appomattox River in the dark, march 5 miles toward Petersburg before deploying for his attack. In short, Grant's expectation of a dawn offensive was a fantasy, an echo of the poor planning that had plagued Hancock's departure. 5 men, Grant, Meade, Butler, Hancock, and Smith, needed to be in sync for this operation to succeed. But Grant failed to communicate his plans to all of his subordinates, and thus, like a football team that had orchestrated a long drive only to stall at the 3-yard line, the General-in-Chief jeopardized the potential payoff from his brilliant march to the James. Now, P.G.T. Beauregard had been in command of the Department of North Carolina and Southern Virginia since April 23, 1864, a vast theater of operations that extended from where you all are, the mouth of the Cape Fear River, all the way to the south shore of the James. The Virginia portion of his domain was known as the 1st Military District and was under the command of former Virginia Governor Henry A. Wise. Now, Wise had authority only over the garrison troops in his district, while Bushrod Johnson's infantry division bore responsibility for containing Butler at Bermuda 100, behind a compact defensive line known as the Howlett Line, extending about 4 miles from the James on their left to the Appomattox on their right. Because a portion of Johnson's division was on detached service, Beauregard deployed only about 3,300 men on the Howlett Line. At Petersburg, an elaborate defensive perimeter called the Damok Line stretched about 10 miles, featuring 55 artillery batteries connected with an infantry curtain and anchored both above and below Petersburg. Only about 4,000 men covered this expansive line, including a large contingent of local militia, less than 1/3 of Smith's approaching force. No wonder Beauregard feared a disaster and was so adamant about returning Hoke's 6,600 men to his command. But despite the Louisianans' orders the previous night, Hoke would not start to cross the James until nearly noon on the 15th, leaving Beauregard on his own in the impending clash. Now, once informed of his assignment, Smith quickly organized his arriving infantry, many of whom enjoyed little or no rest before starting their march across the pontoon bridges spanning the Appomattox. Smith's plan called for Kautz to lead the way, dispersing any resistance outside of the Damok Line and allowing the infantry to march directly against the works, according to Butler, held by only a skeleton force. The Federals began their march between 2 and 3 a.m., but Kautz was delayed in crossing the bridges, and not until around 5, nearly half an hour after dawn, would Smith's 2 white divisions join Hinks on the south bank. The Union cavalry rode ahead as directed and encountered a stubborn cavalry force, as supported by infantry, dug in on high ground at the Baylor Farm, several miles east of the Damok Line. Declaring the resistance too powerful for cavalry, Smith called on Hinks to shove the rebels aside. The blacks lurched ahead in their first real combat, absorbing significant casualties from a single cavalry regiment supported by 1 battery of artillery. Eventually, the 400 or 500 graycoats fell back, giving the blacks a hard-earned victory, accompanied by a sinister byproduct: the intimidation of Baldy Smith. At a most unexpected place, I had been called upon to develop my force and make an assault, and this fact caused me at once to cease taking anything for granted that had been asserted, Smith would explain. Grant's dawn attack, already a moot point, would now face further delay. Smith resumed his advance with extreme caution, advancing a skirmish line and halting at every intervening ridge between Baylor's Farm and the Damok Line. Not until afternoon did the Federals pull up in sight of the Confederate defenses. Smith deployed his 3 infantry divisions from the Appomattox on his right, southward, with Hinks on his left, and the cavalry ranging even farther south. All along the line, rebel cannon belched out at their new targets, inflicting minor casualties, but further persuading Smith that, contrary to Butler's assurances, Beauregard's defenses were substantial. Smith opted to conduct a thorough reconnaissance, and it would take him nearly all afternoon to decide on targeting a position called Battery 5, a salient near the City Point Railroad. Meanwhile, Hancock left the south bank of the James in an ambulance, his festering Gettysburg wound preventing the Corps commander from actively overseeing his march. His men wilted under unrelenting heat, traversing poor roads and armed with faulty maps, so inadequate that Francis Barlow's division marched in the wrong direction and became lost. Not until 5:30 p.m. did David Birney's division reach a crossroads about 4 miles east of Petersburg. Here, breathless couriers arrived from Grant and Smith with orders to immediately support Smith's impending attack. Surprised by the urgency of these orders, Hancock struggled to determine precisely where Smith wanted him to go, confusion abetted by poor staff work. The same lack of an informed guiding hand that had so delayed Hancock's march compromised the ability of Smith and Hancock to cooperate. With Meade completely out of the command loop, Butler doing little to encourage Smith to attack, and Grant passively relying on Butler to keep him apprised, seemingly unconcerned that his offensive had been so long delayed. Now, Smith's personal reconnaissance that afternoon, an exercise that required 2 hours, identified a ravine between batteries 6 and 7 that offered sufficient defilade to move a body of troops behind powerful battery 5. Even so, Smith feared that if the works contained a strong complement of infantry supporting the obvious artillery presence, any attack would fail. My best chance of success, he explained, was to trust to a very heavy skirmish line, which would not of itself attract much artillery fire and which yet would be sufficient to do the work if the enemy was not very strong in infantry. Troops from William Brooks's division would initiate the attack, triggering supporting assaults by John Martindale's division on his right and Hinks's African Americans on his left. Smith further thought that it prudent to first degrade Beauregard's defenders with artillery. But when he called on his artillery chief to move the guns into position, to my dismay, he said, I found him without authority to have taken out the horses and sent them to water. Not until 7 p.m. would Smith's guns be available. Then the cannons roared and soon fell silent. Smith sent his infantry forward. They not only penetrated through the ravine and behind batteries 5 and 6, but threatened these bastions from the front. The entire complement of Confederate artillery surrendered, along with most of its supporting infantry. On Brooks's right, Martindale scattered the defenders of batteries 3 and 4, while the black troops accomplished even more, successfully assaulting batteries 7 and 8, and then compelling the Confederates to abandon batteries 9 and 10, a landmark achievement that earned the African Americans grudging respect from many of their previously dismissive white comrades. By the time darkness enveloped the blood-stained landscape, Smith had conquered 2 miles of the Confederate line, captured at least 13 guns, and inflicted hundreds of casualties. Now the question remained, what would the Federals do with this tardy but decisive victory? With Barlow's division lost, only Birney's and John Gibbon's divisions were in position to respond to the urgent messages to assist Smith. But as I said, poor communications and confusing geography conspired to delay their arrival until after dark, when the serious fighting had already run its course. Hancock met with Smith about 9 p.m., who explained what had transpired and pointed out the extent of his achievement. Hancock confirmed that Birney and Gibbon were available to continue the offensive. Although Hancock outranked Smith, he deferred to his junior's judgment, desiring, he said, not to interfere with his honor, as it was his to direct to take the place. Smith declined to resume the attack, requesting only that Hancock's 2 divisions relieve Brooks and Hinks at the front and prepare to meet any Confederate counterattack. Second Corps units stumbled forward in the dark and between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. occupied the captured line. Now, one of the enduring questions of the Petersburg story is the wisdom of Smith's and Hancock's decision that night. There were certainly bitter voices who decried the failure to press ahead and capture Petersburg. Private Frank Wilkeson of the 4th U.S. Artillery, for example, remembered that gradually the fact that we were not to fight that night impressed itself on us. The range of the intelligent enlisted men was devilish. The most blood-curdling blasphemy I ever listened to, I heard that night, uttered by men who knew they were to be sacrificed in the morning. Many blamed Smith, such as the staff officer who believed that Petersburg would have gone like a rotten branch had Smith exercised sufficient courage. Other critics cited the bright moonlight that would have guided the Federals into what was presumed to be a nearly defenseless city. Now, it's certainly easy to simply condemn Baldy Smith, a rather unlikable character, whose post-war apologia reeked with prevarication, but to do so, I think, is too simplistic. Although Hancock is blameless for his Corps' protracted march from the James on June 15th, he certainly could have insisted on a coordinated advance after 9 p.m. if, in his judgment, such an attack was warranted. He did not. Neither of the Army commanders, Butler or Meade, set foot anywhere near the scene of action, nor did Grant, whose headquarters at City Point were barely an hour's ride distant. Any of these 3 men had the authority to order an advance. Now, Smith would cite a plethora of reasons for discontinuing the assault, chief among them the darkness and the disorganization of his troops, particularly the blacks. Smith also believed that by capturing batteries 3 through 10, he could mount an artillery barrage close enough to render Petersburg indefensible. But perhaps most of all, Smith expressed concern that the Confederates had been reinforced, and to plunge his troops into the darkness against an enemy of unknown strength would have been, in his words, simple madness, and would have almost inevitably resulted in disaster and the loss of all that we had gained. Although in hindsight, one may conclude that Hancock and Smith should have pressed on that night, I think they acted reasonably, and the Confederates were, in fact, growing in strength. Now, General Beauregard had arrived in Petersburg that evening about 6 p.m., traveling from his headquarters north of the Appomattox. The attack that quickly followed didn't surprise him, as he had been predicting such an eventuality for days. But now the question was simple. Should he defend Petersburg by stripping the defenses at Bermuda Hundred, or forsake the Cockade City and hold the Howlett Line? Beauregard had unsuccessfully appealed for guidance on this important question all day, so he was on his own when the Union assault erupted. Not long after the Federal breakthrough, the leading elements of Hoke's division began to arrive in Petersburg in the form of Johnson Haygood's 1,400 South Carolinians, much to the delight of the panic-stricken citizens. Haygood initially received instructions to extend the Army's right flank, but when news of the collapse of the eastern portion of the Damocq Line reached Petersburg, new orders sent Haygood on the City Point Road to establish a defensive perimeter behind the broken batteries. Haygood almost stumbled into the Federals in the dark, but eventually, with the aid of Beauregard's competent chief engineer, David B. Harris, he drew a new line along a ridge behind Harrison's Creek, connecting the intact Damocq Line batteries 2 and 15. During the night, Alfred Colquitt's Georgians, and then the North Carolinians of James Martin's and Thomas Clingman's brigades extended the line, digging furiously to create an earthwork barrier. In the meantime, Beauregard made the decision to abandon the Howlett Line and bring Johnson's division to Petersburg, giving him around 11,000 men to meet the combined forces of Smith and Hancock, who would still outnumber the Confederates 3-1. Beauregard informed Lee of his decision and begged him to replace Johnson's troops before Butler, discovering the Howlett Line evacuated, moved west to sever the railroad connection between Richmond and Petersburg. In the pre-dawn hours of June 16th, Lee ordered George Pickett's 1st Corps Division of about 4,500 men to cross the James for this purpose. So how would the Federal High Command react on June 16th to this developing situation? Now, Lee put Pickett's division on the road to the river crossings at 3 a.m., and a few hours later, Charles Field's 1st Corps Division also started for the south side. However, alert Union officers had detected suspicious sounds during the night, and at early daylight probed forward. A few troops Johnson had left behind quickly retreated, and the gleeful Bluecoats, although only a fraction of Butler's available troops, began ripping up the tracks of the Richmond and Petersburg Railroad. Meanwhile, 2 additional Union corps, Burnside's 9th and Warren's 5th, began using the completed pontoon bridge and the ferry boats to cross the James, with orders to extend Hancock's left. At the same time, Johnson's Graycoats crossed the Appomattox and extended the new Confederate defensive perimeter, dubbed the Haygood Line, to mirror Hancock's deployment. Throughout the day, both the 2nd and 18th Corps crept cautiously forward and discovered the new rebel defenses. Grant merely ordered Burnside and Warren to provide flank protection to Hancock, while the 2nd and 18th Corps spent the day identifying points for a proposed evening attack. As the Federals probed, the Confederates dug, so that by late on the afternoon of June 16th, Beauregard had fashioned the Haygood Line into a reasonably formidable position. Meanwhile, at Bermuda Hundred, Butler committed only a relative handful of his troops to the occupation and destruction of the rail link vitally connecting Richmond and Petersburg. As a result, when Pickett's leading brigades arrived on the scene and charged forward, the Federals quickly withdrew. I think Butler's failure to fortify and hold his position on the Richmond and Petersburg Railroad was an even more egregious mistake than the overcaution of Hancock and Smith the previous evening. When Field's division arrived late in the day, the opportunity to block additional reinforcements from Lee to Beauregard vanished. South of the Appomattox, Meade launched his attack at 6 p.m. June 16. All three corps then present, the 18th, 2nd, and 9th, on the Union left advanced. Smith and Burnside merely demonstrated, never seriously challenging the Confederates in their front. Hancock's attack was a bit more spirited and resulted in the captures of batteries 13 through 15, but ran out of steam at dark without seriously damaging Beauregard's perimeter. The Confederate commander, however, recognized that the Haygood line was vulnerable and ordered Colonel Harris to lay out new defenses even closer to Petersburg. Now, during the day, Lee had pressed Beauregard no fewer than 4 times for information on Meade's whereabouts. At 9:30 a.m., Beauregard had notified Lee of Hancock's presence, but that message was delivered to Lee's headquarters north of the James. And when Lee shifted his command post to the south side, this important communique failed to catch up. Not until 7 p.m. would Beauregard again mention the presence of the Second Corps. News now to Lee that at least a portion of Meade's army had crossed the James. Inexplicably, despite the skirmishing conducted by Burnside that evening, Beauregard remained unaware that the 9th Corps was on the ground, not to mention the swiftly arriving 5th Corps. How Beauregard's network of scouts along the James failed to detect the 2,000-foot-long pontoon bridge and a fleet of vessels ferrying tens of thousands of Yankees toward Petersburg remains a mystery. Thus, Lee contented himself with shifting Kershaw's final 1st Corps division closer to the pontoon bridge, but keeping A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps on the north side in position to defend Richmond against what was now a phantom force. Well, after the fighting died out on the evening of June 16th, Grant informed Meade that Butler reported as many as 50,000 Confederate troops had been spotted between Malvern Hill and Deep Bottom on the north side of the James. Grant admitted, however, that, quote, not knowing appearances in front of you, I cannot give positive directions how far or how hard you should push in the morning. I will leave this to your judgment, knowing that you will push any advantage that may be gained. Thus, the General-in-Chief continued to delegate operational decisions to Meade. The first offensive at Petersburg was almost entirely Meade's show. The Pennsylvanian did not hesitate. He passed the information on to Hancock and Burnside, encouraging those officers to launch attacks to exploit the huge, if possibly fleeting, numerical advantage over the beleaguered Beauregard. Hancock's corps had been bloodied on the 16th, so the primary offensive burden on June 17th would fall on Burnside. Burnside's Black Division had not yet crossed the James, so he would have the services only of his 3 white divisions. During the course of the day, each of these divisions would venture separate assaults, never achieving coordination with each other or the 2nd and 5th Corps on their flanks. The morning assault, conducted by Robert Potter's division, targeted the southern flank of Beauregard's defenses, centered on a high knoll occupied by the Shand House. Potter's men had crept to the base of the hill during the night, and at dawn charged up the slope, sending Wise's Virginians and Matt Ransom's Tar Heels fleeing, while decimating the Tennessee Brigade, capturing 600 men, along with all 4 of the guns on Shand's Hill. Potter expected that his victory would be exploited by the 2nd Corps on his right and reinforcements from James Ledley's 9th Corps division in his rear. But neither of these units advanced. Ledley citing that terrain was too difficult to navigate, and Hancock's men claiming with dubious veracity that they had tried to attack. It was the same old story over again, a most spirited and gallant attack without adequate supports, observed a veteran in the 36th Massachusetts. Had a single corps been on the ground in position, or had the divisions which were ordered to support us been ready to advance, the fearful carnage of the 2 succeeding days would doubtless have been prevented, and the long, tedious, wasting, bloody siege of Petersburg might have been avoided. Orlando B. Wilcox's 9th Corps Division had spent the night behind the 2nd Corps, but about 10 a.m. on June 17th, they marched to the deep ravines east of the Shandhouse Ridge. Burnside assigned his chief engineer, the eccentric Major James St. Clair Morton, to identify the most likely ground for Wilcox's attack. Morton selected terrain north of the Shandhouse, where the Confederates who had been defeated that morning were desperately preparing a new line of works that was of limited utility. Wilcox's men boiled out of their protective ravine about 2 o'clock, hampered by a faulty tactical alignment and greeted by waves of Confederate canister. Nevertheless, the Federals almost reached the makeshift Confederate works when Major Morton directed the men to execute a half-wheel to the right, causing them to march parallel to the enemy line for 200 yards and exposing their entire left flank to the rebel defenders. Morton paid for this ill-conceived tactic with his life, and Wilcox's men fled for safety behind Hancock's recumbent troops. It seems as though our blue coats lay there thickly as sheaves of grain on a bountiful harvest field, wrote a Wisconsin soldier. It was a veritable harvest of death. The final 9th Corps attack of the day came from the division commanded by James H. Ledlie. Now, Ledlie, of course, would become infamous for his role in the Battle of the Crater 6 weeks later, but his flaws were already apparent to any observer. His previous combat experience at the North Anna River in May featured a drunken and unauthorized attack. By the time his division was ready to execute their orders on June 17th, Ledlie was too inebriated to assume command. The supply of artificial courage which he had taken carried him beyond the proper counterpoise and rendered him orders to combat in which condition he remained in the ravine, explained a Massachusetts captain. One of Ledlie's brigade commanders led the assault, which began shortly before sunset. The Federals struck Wise's regiments and a portion of Stephen Elliott's South Carolina brigade and collapsed the Confederate defenses. But by 10 p.m., the Federals ran out of steam and ammunition, and a series of Confederate counterattacks regained the lost ground. The fighting finally petered out about midnight. All during that day, Colonel Harris had worked diligently to identify a third line of defense closer to Petersburg. Once the combat subsided, Beauregard's exhausted warriors quietly slipped out of the Haygood line and fell back to Harris's designated position 800 to 1,000 yards in the rear. The weary rebels spent what was left of the night frantically digging. At Bermuda 100, Pickett had restored all of the works that had been lost the day before, while Butler seemed content with the defensive, despite being sent 2 6th Corps divisions. As frustrating as the Federal performance on June 17th must have been to Meade and Grant, Robert E. Lee suffered his own measure of anxiety that day. At daybreak, he again pressed Beauregard to clarify the identity of his opponents. The Creole commander replied that he faced 2 corps of Federals, presumably meaning the 18th and 2nd Corps, still failing to acknowledge the presence of Burnside and Warren. At 11:15 that morning, Beauregard compounded the confusion by informing Lee that Warren had likely departed for the Piedmont to confront Early, boldly suggesting that Lee send him reinforcements so that he could crush the Yankees in his front. But not long thereafter, Beauregard changed his tune, telling Lee that a local citizen had reported as many as 30,000 Federals crossing the James and appealed for help to hold his position. One can only imagine Lee's reaction to this conflicting intelligence. At 4:30 that afternoon, Lee told Beauregard have no information of Grant's crossing James River, but he ordered Hill and Kershaw to sidle even closer to the river crossings. Then at last, Beauregard provided Lee with unambiguous confirmation that the 9th Corps was on the ground in front of him and that the 5th and 6th Corps were either there or en route to Petersburg. Lee finally had the information he needed to shift his army. He ordered Kershaw to cross the river immediately, and told Hill to march to the pontoon bridge and be prepared to move to the south side at dawn. It was now a race. Would Meade and Grant succeed in overwhelming Beauregard's exhausted men before the Army of Northern Virginia could arrive and save the city? Kershaw's division began its march to Petersburg at 3 a.m. And a few hours later, Hill's corps started tramping across the pontoon bridge at Chaffin's Bluff, while Field's brigades left their works at Bermuda 100, following in Kershaw's footsteps. Union forces were also on the move that morning, reacting to Meade's nighttime orders to commence a coordinated advance at daylight. 4 corps, the 18th, 2nd, 9th, and 5th, from north to south, lurched forward, prepared to engage the Confederates. In some places they met resistance, but most of the would-be attackers encountered the abandoned works of the Haygood Line. Surprised, but undeterred, Meade told his corps commanders to prepare a new attack focused on the recently completed Harris Line. The 18th and 2nd Corps pressed forward, but soon discovered that the rebel works in their front were well prepared and adequately manned, and their efforts came to naught. Farther south, the 9th and 5th Corps never advanced at all, either claiming to be stymied by a lack of flank protection or professing that they had never received mandatory orders to assault. And these failures infuriated Meade, who knew that the window of opportunity was closing fast. For once losing his poise, the Army commander snapped, "I find it useless to appoint an hour to effect cooperation," and he demanded that all 4 of his corps make an immediate attack, irrespective of the disposition of the other corps. By this time, Kershaw had extended the Confederate right, and Field was moving into position, while Hill's troops were legging it south. The Federals responded to Meade's frustrated and peremptory orders in an uneven and universally unsuccessful fashion. On the far left, Warren's advance ran into Johnson's men and the fresh soldiers of Kershaw's division. The brigade, commanded by a former college professor from Maine, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, charged about 3 p.m., yelling like a pack of infuriated devils, reaching the base of the Confederate works before lethal fire pouring from cannons and rifles stopped them cold. Colonel Chamberlain was among the casualties, but he would defy medical opinion and survive his wound, solidifying his place in history in 1865 at Petersburg and Appomattox. At the other end of the line, Hancock's men poised for another effort to breach the rebel works, focusing on high ground known as Colquitt's Salient. The assault commenced between 4 and 4:30, but in the face of furious Confederate fire, most of the Federals took a few steps forward and hit the ground, having experienced enough of attacking earthworks to recognize a forlorn hope when they saw one. A large regiment of relatively green heavy artillerists, now serving as infantry, were not so naive as to underestimate their peril, but nevertheless they poured out of some defilade along the Prince George Courthouse Road into an open field in front of Colquitt's Salient, emerging 200 yards from the rebel line. That field became a seething hell, recalled one of the survivors of the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery. They poured it into us from the front, from the right, and from the left. In 10 minutes, 632 of the roughly 900 men who began the charge were killed or wounded, the largest loss suffered in one battle by any regiment during the entire war. The final Union spasm of the day came from Burnside's bloodied veterans, elements of whom managed to cross the Norfolk and Petersburg Railroad in front of a Confederate strongpoint known as Elliott's or Pegram's Salient. But like the men on either side of them, failed to penetrate the Confederate works. These men dug in, however, exploiting the cover provided by the valley of Port Creek, setting the stage for the Battle of the Crater. Lee had arrived in Petersburg shortly before noon, met with Beauregard at the Customs House downtown, and then rode with Beauregard to high ground near the city reservoir. The mercurial Creole urged Lee to undertake an offensive against the exposed Federal left flank, but Lee declined, preferring to remain on the defensive. That decision, of course, led to the successful repulse of the many uncoordinated Union attacks that afternoon that ended the 1st Petersburg offensive. We triumphed at last against the fearful odds in holding the invaders at bay, and saving the city from the rule of the Negro and the Beast, boasted a Virginia private. The Yankees, as a large force, admitted a South Carolinian, but if they keep on charging, we will have them all killed in a few days. Ulysses S. Grant, for the time being at least, had seen enough killing. Although estimates vary, my best guess is about 13,000 federal soldiers became casualties between June 15th and 18th. Confederate casualty figures are even more murky, but 2,500 to 3,000 seems a reasonable guess. About 10 o'clock that evening, George Meade sent a summary of the day's action to Grant, concluding by expressing great regret that I am not able to report more success, and adding, but I believe every effort to command it has been made. Grant immediately replied without a hint of condemnation. I am perfectly satisfied that all that has been done could be done. But of course, this was far from the truth. Until the arrival of the first troops from Lee's army on the morning of June 18th, Grant's army group outnumbered its opponents as much as 5-1, odds that, despite the Confederate earthworks, should have spelled triumph. A few weeks later, Meade confessed to a trusted staff officer that I should have taken Petersburg. I had reason to calculate on success, but he didn't. Why? The primary cause of the federal failure can be found in the condition of its troops, particularly Meade's own Army of the Potomac. The Army is exhausted, admitted its commander. With 49 days of continued marching and fighting, it absolutely requires rest. Moreover, he added, we cannot replace officers with experienced men, and there's no time for reorganization or careful selection. There can be no doubt that the horrendous casualties and consequential attrition at the line and field command levels sustained from the Wilderness to Cold Harbor reduced the efficiency and esprit de corps of Meade's army. With many of his best tactical leaders and bravest fighting men laying in shallow graves or languishing in hospitals, Meade's offensive capabilities had been grossly diminished. Now, that's not to say that the soldiers were too demoralized to fight. The long list of killed and wounded during the first offensive stands as mute testimony, but their willingness and ability to press an attack had all but vanished. There were also mistakes made at the higher command levels. Grant's failure to communicate his plan to all the principals involved severely compromised his chance for success on June 15th. Smith's timidity in executing his assault that day allowed reinforcements to bolster Beauregard's shattered ranks that evening, and the tardy attack meant that the push into Petersburg must occur in the dark, a risk neither Smith nor Hancock was willing to take. That hesitation and conservative mindset infected the other corps commanders, who only rarely felt sufficiently comfortable about their flanks to advance in concert with one another, leading to the piecemeal assaults that characterized federal operations during the succeeding 3 days. Benjamin Butler fumbled a golden opportunity to sever the direct road and railroad connection between Richmond and Petersburg when he so easily surrendered his position between the two cities, allowing Lee to filter troops to Petersburg without interference. And at least part of the overall explanation lies with the general-in-chief, whose fingerprints were all but invisible during those 4 days, although delegating operational decisions was typical of Grant's generalship. Of course, the Confederates had a great deal to do with the outcome. Beauregard and his little army performed about as well as any force during the entire war. As one observer put it, with such fearful and almost incredible odds against him, General Beauregard maintained a successful barrier to the federal advance, a feat of war almost without precedent. Well, that may be overstating the case just a tad. Beauregard certainly deserves high praise for selecting his 2 new lines of defense, timing the evacuation of the old lines flawlessly, and allocating Hoke's and Johnson's brigades properly. However, there's little evidence of Beauregard's influence on the combat that thwarted the Union attacks, credit for that residing with subordinate officers to the limited degree of tactical improvisation when fighting on the defense. On the negative side of Beauregard's ledger, his remarkably poor intelligence and inconsistent assessment of the situation in his front contributed to Lee's hesitation to reinforce his beleaguered comrade. As for Lee, historians often cite his failure to reinforce Petersburg more quickly as one of the worst blemishes on his record. Although there can be no question that Grant stole a march on the great commander, and that his deception kept Lee uncertain of his enemy's whereabouts and intentions, I think Lee acted reasonably, given the information available to him between June 13th and 17th. Lee's first responsibility was to protect Richmond, and without some assurance that the Federal Army was not lurking on the north side of the James, his decision to send incremental reinforcements to the south was reasonable and prudent. Once he had definitive information of the Federal presence at Petersburg, he acted swiftly. The first offensive at Petersburg, my friends, I think should be ranked among the major battles of the Civil War. More than 125,000 soldiers battled for 4 days, resulting in combined casualties approaching 16,000 men, numbers that correlate with the greatest and bloodiest engagements of the war. Grant's failure to capture Petersburg would lead to 8 more offensives during the next 288 days before he achieved a victory that might have been his 9 months earlier. Thank you very much. All right.
Okay. Well,
I-
thank you, Will. I wish you could hear the applause, but that's one of the drawbacks here. Will, let me, one of the questions, we know Petersburg, the fortifications became more extensive as the siege went along. What would have been the fortifications like that the Confederates were using, had been able to build for this 4 days?
Well, the Democ line was flawed. It was an extensive line. First of all, it was 10 miles long. It would require an army of about 55 or 60,000 men to defend it all, and consequently, Beauregard had about 4,000. So in that sense, the works were very vulnerable. They had deteriorated somewhat since the time they were built in 1863. And as Smith was quite accurately discovered, there were weak points in the line, like that ravine. Those of you who have been to Petersburg battlefield, national battlefield, will know that you approach on a state highway called Highway 36. That highway runs through that ravine that Smith used to get in behind the Confederate defenses. So the Democ line had its problems, but it was very, it had lots of artillery positions in it. Now the Howlett line that existed in May of 1864 was very strong. It was anchored on flanks that could not be turned, on the left on the James River and on the right on the Appomattox River. So one of the first things that you have to do when creating a defensive position is protect your flanks. And they were absolutely unassailable. The works were strong and got stronger as the campaign went along. And so the history of the fighting at Bermuda 100 from June 18th through April 2nd, when the campaign ended, is a pretty benign one, because the Confederates were not interested in making an assault. And the Federals realized that there really wasn't any opportunity for them to make an attack. So the only combat on Bermuda 100 for the next 9 months was small raids on the picket lines and so forth. Now, as the campaign went along, Mike, the earthworks became very, very strong. They were unassailable. And after Grant's attempt to blow up the Confederate line in July, you know, as the Battle of the Crater, Grant realized that attacking these earthworks, even with innovative tactics like exploding a mine underneath them, was not the key to victory. And so for the next 7 months, his efforts were devoted to getting around the vulnerable Confederate right flank. Not only was it vulnerable, but it also was protecting the one remaining supply line into Petersburg, the South Side Railroad, upon which Lee depended for his survival. So that's really, in a macro sense, that's the story of the Petersburg campaign, reducing it to its smallest common denominator. Strong earthworks making frontal attacks impractical, and leaving Grant with his superiority forces able to defend his own lines parallel to the Confederates and still have excess troops to launch flank attacks around the Confederate right. Lee would meet those flank attacks. He would counterattack. He would stop Grant, but would not be able to drive Grant away. Both armies would extend their lines so that by April of 1865, on the eve of the end of the campaign, the earthworks around Richmond and Petersburg, that one continuous line running from the Chickahominy River northeast of Richmond all the way to the southwest of Petersburg, was 39 miles long. I mean, it's an incredibly huge campaign. And that's why I've been working on it for 14 years, and I'm still.
Well, I know it's getting late, and I'll let you go. Can you give us just a brief update on how the books are coming and any dates coming up that we need to know about?
Well, sure. I made a decision, probably not making my editor very happy, that instead of just concentrating on the second volume, which is going to carry the story through the election of 1864, I would try to do all the research and all the prep for both remaining volumes to kick the campaign all the way to the end. So I've been using the time I've had during the pandemic here to take thousands and thousands of documents that I've collected, literally thousands and thousands of documents, skim them for relevant material, and then turn them into 5x8 note cards, which I will then use to start writing. So I expect that I'll start writing volume 2 next year. I certainly will start writing it next year. Probably will deliver it to North Carolina Press sometime in 2022. And then the third volume should follow fairly quickly after that.
Great, that sounds good. Using note cards, huh? That's old school, Will. That's old
me.
school, buddy.
Hey, listen, look at me. I'm old. I am old.
Well, listen, hey, Will, thanks very much. And as always, if you get up this way, give me a call. We'll meet in Myrtle Beach, and you can steal some money out of my wallet.
Yeah, you're going to give me 2 shots, because I remember you. Thanks a lot.
Hey.
And thanks to everybody that tuned into this. We appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks, Will. I'll be in touch with you shortly, Will.